And can invite Ruth Maguire on behalf of the committee to open the debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate the Equalities and Human Rights Committee's Valuing the Third Sector report and our most recent budget scrutiny work, which provides an update on our views on the impact of the pandemic on the voluntary sector. Although the committee's report was published in November last year, due to the impact of the pandemic, it's not been possible to debate the report until today. I'd like to thank committee colleagues for their hard work, some of whom have now moved on, and all the people who provided written and oral evidence. In particular, I'd like to say a special thank you to Glasgow Council for the voluntary sector and the Forth Valley Third Sector interfaces in Falkirk, Stirling and Clackmannanshire. With their help, the committee held events with 60 voluntary organisations who shared their invaluable experience with us. As the Chamber knows, COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on many who already face disadvantage and discrimination. Our 2019 report emphasised that the voluntary sector has a valuable role to play in supporting the equality and human rights agendas in Scotland. It's therefore no surprise to us that the work of charities was key to providing immediate support to many people in their localities during the pandemic. Yet many charities are now in a situation where they may not survive for much longer. Research by the Scottish Charity Regulator found that 20% of Scottish charities are facing a critical threat to their financial viability in the next 12 months, as incomes fall and demand for service grows. Today's debate is important to ensure the committee's recommendations are not lost sight of and indeed are implemented, to ensure the well-being and sustainability of the voluntary sector so it can continue to play its vital role, not just during the pandemic, but in Scotland's recovery and beyond. I'm sure members will join with me today to say a huge thank you to every single volunteer and charity worker that gives up their time to help those in their communities who are struggling to cope. During the pandemic, these individuals and organisations have leapt into action to support their communities, from providing the basic right to food to ensuring people stay connected with each other to stave off the harmful effects of social isolation. Like inequalities more generally, the pandemic has shone a light on and exacerbated the issues which already existed for the voluntary sector. The committee's recent budget work continues to highlight two core themes critical to the future of Scotland's voluntary sector. That is funding and partnership, which I'll now focus on. The committee identified last year that voluntary sector funding is complex and precarious. Many voluntary organisations operate on a complex patchwork of statutory funding, fundraised income, earned income and grant income. According to the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, there are over 40,000 third sector organisations in Scotland. 40% of those organisations work in either social services or health. Around 25% of third sector income comes from public sector contracts to carry out services, much with local authorities. It's significant to the debate that local authorities receive around 40% of their total revenue income from the Scottish Government each year. Whilst the committee acknowledges that councils are under pressure to make savings, it's voluntary groups and charities feeling the force of these financial constraints. They're struggling to provide adequate service on the basis of council contracts. We heard from Ian Bruce, Glasgow Council for Voluntary Services, that as a sector, organisations were told to diversify their income away from grant funding and move towards trading, fundraising and contracts. He said, that has been regarded as good practice. Ironically, during the COVID period, that income, which was regarded as more sustainable, has vanished, and organisations that are primarily grant-funded have been more stable. On sustainability of funding, although third sector witnesses welcomed the Scottish Government's £25 million third sector recovery programme, and existing funders had been extremely supportive and accommodating in respect of reporting on the use of the funds in the past few months, Neil Cowan, Poverty Alliance, commented that there are growing fears and anxiety about the long-term financial impact. In 2019, the committee noted the Scottish Government had moved to a 3-year equalities funding cycle. We recommended other funders should follow suit and asked the Scottish Government to set up a working group involving key stakeholders to examine longer-term funding models and for its conclusions to be made available before the end of this parliamentary session. The Scottish Government, in its response to us, said, and I quote, "Duration of funding periods is a matter for other statutory funders." The committee would call on the Scottish Government to rethink its approach and to show leadership in this area, to work with other statutory funders to share the benefits of longer-term funding, to harness the Senior Leadership Forum for Change, and to bring consistency of approach and best practice through the establishment of a working group. The committee would also argue these steps are essential if the Scottish Government is to achieve its national outcomes. We are aware there's no single, direct and effortless solution to the funding issues facing the sector, but the situation could be greatly improved if the Scottish Government, statutory funders like local government, independent funders and the sector itself were to work strategically together to ensure financial sustainability of the sector. Let me now move on to talk more about partnership and collaborative working. Working in partnership was a key theme that arose in our 2019 report. There was an acknowledgement from the sector that it should be looking towards collaboration, for example, co-location to cut overhead costs, working together to make addressing shared issues easier and enabling information to be shared and trust to be built. But by far the greatest barrier to partnership working was the competitive funding environment. Participants at the Forth Valley TSI event questioned how partnership could take place between third sector organisations when they were competing for the same pot of money. Fighting over funding had led to distrust in the sector. One organisation commented, "It's like a war." Conversely, the committee notes in responding to the pandemic, there have been many recent examples of strong partnership working between the voluntary sector and local authorities, the Scottish Government and the private sector that highlight just what can be achieved. At a national level, we've seen extraordinary outcomes which have been achieved through partnership working, such as the temporary eradication of rough sleeping. Success that has come from a partnership approach, shared goals between partners, and the temporary removal of hierarchy and bureaucracy. Our report called for strengthening collaboration around involvement of the sector in service design, involvement of the sector in decommissioning, and a thorough examination of partnership working in the context of a competitive funding environment. As we navigate our way through and out of this health crisis, we must look to Scotland's economic future. The scale of the inequalities and societal problems which Scotland will face in the years to come dictate that no one organisation or sector will have all the answers. As the committee noted in its report, the voluntary sector has a key role to play. The Scottish Government's response to Advisory Group on Economic Recovery commits to strengthening collaboration between the voluntary sector, local authorities and Scottish Government. It's unclear how exactly this work will be taken forward. We asked the Scottish Government how the issues raised in our report and most recent budget letter will be addressed in its economic recovery planning. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the third sector should be valued, not just for the services it provides, but also because of who it employs. For example, many women and carers who would find it difficult to find employment round their commitments. It also contributes significantly to employment skills for our young people and people with disabilities. So let us not forget that by supporting our voluntary sector, we're helping countless people to enrich their lives and the lives of others. We must embrace the adversity of the pandemic and seize it as an opportunity to do things differently. We must learn from innovative practice shown by some funders in the third sector during the pandemic. The COVID crisis has shone a light on the issues impacting the sector and on inequality in our society. Indeed, I would argue that the recommendations in the committee's report are now even more relevant. I move the motion in my name.